Up next, Macabre Mansion presents The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, based on the classic story by Washington Irving. Starring Kyle Bear, Virginia Hay, Tiffany LaBarbera, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, Jim O'Rear, and Daniel Roebuck. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at the broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small rural port known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, by the good housewives of the adjacent country, due to the tendency of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley among high hills which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just a murmur enough to lull one to sleep, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquillity. I remember, when I was a child, that my first exploit in squirrel hunting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is particularly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was reverberated by angry echoes. If I ever should wish for a place where I might hide from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remainder of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the tranquility of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is that the place still remains under the sway of some kind of witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual trance-like state. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to strange visions, frequently see bizarre sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions, and nightmares regularly make themselves at home. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region, and seems to be the commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. This figure has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and this spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. I mention this peaceful spot with praise, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embossed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great surge of incessant change in other parts of this country sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I walked the streets of Sleepy Hollow, I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. It was in this place where a man by the name of Ichabod Crane sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which yearly supplies the country with schoolmasters. It was a peaceful morning when Ichabod Crane first arrived in the town of Sleepy Hollow, greeting the many townspeople in the streets as he passed by.
Good day, my friends.
Good day to you, sir. My name is Hans, and this is my wife, Betty.
Pleasure to meet you.
You are a stranger to these parts?
We don't get many strangers here.
Well, we certainly do. Just last week I recall a traveller.
That was no traveller, you nincompoop. That was my mother.
Ah, just as well. She was on her way.
Ugh. Where would you be headed, sir?
I'm looking for Sleepy Hollow.
Wonderful. You are in Sleepy Hollow now.
What brings you to our town, sir?
You are certainly quite nosy. What business is it of yours?
I might ask the same of you, you doddering idiots.
Hag.
Brainless donkey.
I must be brainless to spend my days and nights with you.
It is no bother. My name is Ichabod Crane. I am to be the new schoolmaster.
A schoolmaster.
A schoolmaster. Oh, I didn't know that we needed one.
How would you? You never went to school.
Maybe if I'd gotten an education, I wouldn't have wound up with you.
Very nice meeting you, but I think I'll just be on my way.
The Clausens are hosting a dance at their farm tonight, just at the end of this road. It might be a nice way to introduce yourself to the people of Sleepy Hollow.
Thank you. I suppose I will see you there.
Ichabod Crane was tall, but exceedingly lanky, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along on a windy day with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the symbol of famine descending upon the earth. His awkward appearance did not go unnoticed by the youngsters of Sleepy Hollow.
Lisa, have you seen the new school teacher?
He's rather funny looking.
Oh, I think he looks just fine.
I hear he's very strict.
He looks like a scarecrow.
He's better than the country bumpkins we have around here. He's a gentleman.
Well, I hear he's very well read. He's read several books all the way through. He's read Cotton Mather's History of the New England Witchcraft.
I didn't know that.
You see, he'll fit in around here quite well.
Ichabod took hands up on his invitation to dance that night, and soon found himself waltzing across the crowded floor with the hostess, Mrs. Clausen.
How are you enjoying our part of the world, Mr. Crane?
Very well, Miss Clausen. Very well indeed.
Do you think you will enjoy teaching our children, Mr. Crane?
Most certainly. Wherever I go, I am extremely fulfilled in my teaching endeavors, and the students are always beholden in their gratitude for what they glean through my inspiration.
You dance very well, Mr. Crane.
Thank you. I believe as schoolmaster it is my duty to be fluent in as many community pastimes as possible. But do not think I am a soft touch, Mrs. Clausen.
No.
A splendid dancer I may be, and light on my feet most certainly, but I'm a firm believer in the old saying, spare the rod, spoil the child. We do not want our children spoiled now, do we?
His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly patched with pages from old books. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a rope twisted in the handle of the door and stakes set against the window shutters, so that if a thief got in, he would find some embarrassment in trying to get out. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant area, just at the foot of a woody hill with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From inside, the low murmur of his pupils' voices going over their lessons might be heard on a drowsy day like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the schoolmaster. In a tone of menace or command, he urged some dawdler along the flowery path of knowledge.
Children, I would remind you, undutiful children are cursed by God. The fiends of darkness will be the ravens and the eagles that shall fasten their talons in the eyes of those children. Let there be no sulliness, no sauciness, no rudeness in your behavior. You will, with all consciousness of God, honor thy schoolmaster, and perform the task which he imposes upon you. Don't set light by your schoolmaster, but love him, prize him, hearken to him, and be thankful to him, and thankful to God for him. These are the ways to escape the curses of God.
However, I would not have it imagined that he was one of those cruel rulers of a school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. The puny child that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some tough, stubborn student. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it up with the assurance that
you will remember it and thank me for it as long as you shall live.
When school hours were over, he was the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would escort some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a big eater, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successfully a week at a time, making the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief, so that all of his food and lodging was not too much of a burden on the various families. He had several ways of rendering himself useful. He assisted the farmers, occasionally with light labor helped to make the hay, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. While doing this, he put aside all his dominant dignity with which he lorded over the school, and became wonderfully genteel and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and, like the lion who held the lamb, he would sit with the child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for hours at a time. In addition to his other vocations, he was also the singing master of the neighborhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folk in song.
La 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 la.
It was a matter of little vanity to him on Sundays to take the station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the psalm from the parson. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments compared to the rough country folk, and inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to bring about a little stir at the tea-table of a farmhouse, usually causing the ladies to break out the good china and prepare additional cakes of sweetmeats. Ichabod, therefore, was happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. He would often be found among them in the churchyard, between services on Sunday, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, or reciting, for their amusement, all the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance. For his nomadic lifestyle, he was also a kind of traveling gazette, carrying a local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of insightfulness and simple gullibility. His appetite for the marvelous and his power of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. It was often his delight, after school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there read over old Mather's direful tales of witchcraft, until the gathering dusk of evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he made his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouses, where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature flooded his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the booting cry of a tree toad, the harbinger of storm, the dreary hooting of a screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost, the fireflies too, which sparked most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path, and if, by chance, a huge beetle came winging against him, the poor cad was ready to give up the ghost, with the idea that he was struck by the witch's token. His only resource on such occasions to drive away the evil spirits inside his mind was to sing songs. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors in the evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody floating from a distant hill or along the dusky road. As Ichabod became more and more entwined in the people of Sleepy Hollow's lives, he found himself invited to every dance, luncheon, and assorted function the townspeople organized. It was not long after arriving that Ichabod found himself at another dance, this time conversing with the wealthy host, Mr. Baltus Van Tassel, a meeting that would change the course of Ichabod's life as he knew it. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it. His farm was situated on the banks of the Hudson in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, and at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water, which stole away through the grass to a neighboring brook that babbled along among alders and dwarf willows. Next to the farmhouse was a vast barn which seemed bustling forth with the treasures of the farm. Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves, and rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up as if watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about their dames, were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Unwieldy porkers were grunting in their pens, enjoying the abundance of slop. A stately squadron of snowy geese were floating in an adjacent pond, convoying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard, and guinea fowls fretted about like ill-tempered housewives. Before the barn door strutted the gallant rooster. That pattern of a husband, a warrior, and a fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowing in the pride of the gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet and then generously calling his ever-hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he had discovered. Ichabod was immediately drawn to the wealth that surrounded the Van Tassel's farm, and his thoughts turned to how he might be able to claim a piece of it for himself. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands and the rich fields of wheat, rye, buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with fruit, his mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured every pig roasting with an apple in its mouth, the pigeons snugly put in bed in comfortable pie and tucked in with a blanket of crust, the geese swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples. In the porker's future he saw bacon and juicy relishing ham, and the turkeys were daintily trussed up with their gizzards under their wings. When Ichabod entered the Van Tassel house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses, with high-ridged but low-sloping roofs built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers, the low projecting eaves forming a gathering place along the front capable of being closed up in the bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harnesses, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for the fishing of neighboring rivers. Benches were built along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this open space, the wandering Ichabod entered the hall which formed the center of the mansion and the place of usual residence. Here rows of resplendent pewter arranged on a long dresser dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey-woolsey just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung by garland along the walls, mingled with the goud of red peppers. A door left ajar gave a peep into the best parlour, where the claw-footed chairs and the dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. Andirons with their accompanying shovel and tongs glistened. Mock oranges with conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various coloured bird eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the centre of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed an immense treasure of old silver and well-mended china. Upon his arrival, Ichabod found himself quickly greeted by Baltus Van Tassel. "How are you enjoying our part of the world, Mr. Crane?"
Very well indeed, Mr. Van Tassel. I am quite taken care of by all the families in the area. I stay with the Clausens this coming week, and then on to the Van Houtens.
"Yeah, Mr. Clausen told me you helped mend the fence yesterday afternoon."
Anything I can do to be of assistance. One must be grateful to one's lodgers, and I must thank you for including me this evening. Your home, it's, so spacious. You're situated in such a prosperous little nook. It's, quite charming.
This was also an evening when another important figure entered Ichabod's life. A burly, roaring, boisterous man by the name of Abraham, or, according to Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Bront. He was a hero of sorts throughout the country, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being extremely dexterous on horseback. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and was always ready for either a fight or a frolic. However, Brom had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of good humour at bottom. He had 3 or 4 companions who regarded him as their model, and regularly followed him around. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight, with whoop and halloo, and old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry-scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim,
"Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang."
The neighbours looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and believed Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. The dance at the Van Tassel farmhouse was already well under way when Brom and 2 members of his gang, Dolph and Peter, arrived. The spacious floor was a twirling wonderland of dancing and festivity as the boys entered.
"Look, I told you. Nothing happens until Brom Bones crosses the threshold."
Everyone always waits for you to arrive, Brom.
They were probably standing like statues. Probably not even moving. Probably not even breathing.
Idiots.
Ow! What?
Of course, many of the young ladies of Sleepy Hollow fancied Brom, and he easily caught their eyes at any function. However, some were not as easily impressed.
Brom is so handsome.
He's got the manners of a wounded bear.
He's been courting Katrina Van Tassel since the summer.
She hasn't been seen with anyone else?
No, I heard Brom scared off every boy in the valley.
And I heard he said he'd pummel anyone else who courted her.
Can you imagine if someone tried to ask her to dance tonight?
Maybe the school teacher will.
Maybe the school teacher will ask you to dance, Mary.
Hush.
Brom won't like it if someone gets in his way.
The teacher wouldn't stand a chance.
Well, how do you know?
Oh, maybe there'll be a fight tonight.
Let's get a good seat.
Ichabod, still in conversation with Mr. Van Tassel, and trying not to allow his greed to show, turned his attention to the approaching Mrs. Van Tassel and her lovely daughter Katrina. A blooming lass of fresh 18, Katrina was plump as a partridge and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches. She was universally famed not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was a bit of a flirt, as might be perceived in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set off her charms. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Saddam, a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country around. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the opposite sex, and it is no wonder that so tempting a morsel soon found favour in his eyes. His heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination ran wild with ideas of how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness.
Mrs. Van Tassel, I am having a most splendid evening.
Have you met my daughter, Katrina? This is Mr. Crane, dear, the new schoolmaster.
Pleased to meet you, Mr. Crane.
I was just telling your father how, spacious the land is here, and vast, and abundant. I've never seen such a meadow. Whoever wins the heart of your daughter, Mr. Van Tassel, will be very lucky indeed. For clearly, Katrina is such a sweet girl, that's what I meant. Miss Van Tassel, may I have the pleasure of this dance?
I would be honored, sir.
The two joined the others on the dance floor. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fibre about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought that St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was before you in person.
Mary, look!
Katrina's dancing with a school teacher.
Oh, maybe she's just being polite.
Look at Brom's face.
Brom had, for some time, singled out the blooming Katrina as the object of his uncouth gallantries, though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear. It was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain as it is that his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's fence on Sunday nights, a sure sign that he was courting her.
Hey, Brom, who's that dancing with Katrina?
What? Who? Who is that pipsqueak?
It's the new school teacher.
What's she doing dancing with him? I'll pummel him.
You can't beat up the schoolmaster, Brom.
Why not?
You just can't.
All right. What's his name?
Ichabod Crane.
He's awful smart, Brom. The only person smarter in all of Sleepy Hollow is the parson.
Ichabod Crane. We'll see about Ichabod Crane.
Ichabod could feel the burning eyes of Brom Bones glaring at him from the distance.
Who is that young man in the corner, Mrs. Van Tassel? He's staring at us with such a glowering eye.
Oh, that's just Brom Bones. He doesn't think anyone should talk to me. He beats up any boy who tries.
Oh, does he? Well, I shouldn't want to get in his way, then.
He's very good-humoured, though, and he's very skilled with horses. Brom is well known for having the fastest horse in all the county.
The fastest horse, you say? What a shame.
What do you mean?
Oh, it's only something I heard. I shouldn't trouble you with it, Mrs. Van Tassel.
Please, call me Katrina.
Only if you call me Ichabod.
What did you hear about Brom, Ichabod?
Only that he beats his horse.
No.
That's how he gets it to go so fast.
That's terrible. I never heard that.
It's such an awful thing to do when he smells very strongly of a stable. A young lady should never be exposed to such boorish odors.
As the evening progressed and Ichabod continued his advances on Katrina, Brom Bones was fit to be tied.
Are you sure I can't beat up the school teacher?
Afraid not.
There has to be something I can do. He's danced 4 dances with her tonight.
But you don't like to dance. You say it all the time. You say you would rather have hot pokers jabbed into the soles of your feet than have to dance.
Idiot.
Ow! What?
I'm putting a stop to this.
No pummeling.
Brom quickly advanced across the room to confront Ichabod and Katrina.
Evening, Miss Katrina.
Good evening, Brom.
May I have the pleasure of escorting you home from the dance?
Actually, I will have the favor of Miss Van Tassel's arm tonight.
Perhaps another time.
What about a horse ride, then? Tomorrow afternoon.
I was going to ask you, Miss Van Tassel. You are in the choir, are you not?
Yes, of course.
Then please, let me offer you a free private singing lesson. I can tell just by looking at you that you have a most pleasant voice. Tomorrow afternoon, if you have nothing else planned?
I would be delighted.
Shall we go?
With a mixture of anger and disgust, Brom returned to the side of his friends.
What happened, Brom?
I'll get that little pipsqueak. If it's the last thing I do, I'll get him.
From that moment forward, the peace of Ichabod's mind was at an end, and the only thought was how to gain the affections of Katrina Van Tassel. In this endeavour, however, he had more obstacles to conquer than a knight of yore who had to battle giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such in order to enter the castle where the lady of his heart was confined. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of the country flirt, beset with a labyrinth of whims which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments. He also had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in a common cause against a new competitor. Such was the formidable rival that Ichabod Crane had to contend, and, considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and in spirit like a supple reed, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, he would jerk back erect and carry his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted by his amours any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Balthus Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter even better than his pipe, and, like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for, as she observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house, or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the gathering place, honest Balthus would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other, watching the wind blow across the field. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in twilight, that hour so favourable to lovers. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point, or door of access, while others have 1,000 avenues and may be captured in 1,000 different ways.
Have you heard?
What?
Katrina Van Tassel is being escorted by the school teacher tonight.
Again? This will be the third dance this fall.
I hear he's been spending a lot of time at the Van Tassel farm.
He's just giving Katrina singing lessons, that's all.
I don't know.
Do you think he's courting Katrina?
No!
I hear Bron Bones' horse is never seen at her fence anymore.
I'd much rather be courted by Brom Bones.
Ugh, there's Brom now.
Ugh, look at him.
He doesn't look very happy.
It serves him right. Act like an animal and you don't get the girl, so there. Oh, Mr. Crane is so smart.
I wonder what he thinks about.
Only smart things, I'm sure.
If only the girls really knew what was on Ichabod's mind.
Land, 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 land! Oh, the day gets closer and closer when all this land will be mine. Certainly there is a firm possibility that one day I will be lord of all of this, the scene of unimaginable luxury and splendor. Surely Brom Bones is nothing now but a smudge on the landscape. The landscape that will soon be mine.
I bet if we could see into Mr. Crane's mind, we'd be amazed at all the smart things he's thinking about this very second.
Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would have carried matters to open warfare and have settled their pretensions to the lady by single combat, but Ichabod was too conscious of Brom's superior might to enter into battle against him. There was something extremely provoking in Ichabod's pacifist-like system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the troublemaker in his disposition and play practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders.
5 minutes. 5 minutes alone is all I need with him. Then we could settle this like men.
We're doing pretty good, though. We've stopped up the chimney at the schoolhouse.
And turn the room topsy-turvy in the middle of the night.
Everyone knows it should be you courting Katrina instead of him.
5 minutes is all I need to fold him in two and stick him on a shelf.
The boys continued to turn so many pranks upon the schoolmaster that Ichabod began to think all the witches in the country were after him. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in the presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner when Brom would pretend to instruct it to sing.
La 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 la.
In this way, matters went on for some time without producing any material effect on the situation between the two men. On a fine autumn afternoon, Ichabod, in a pensive mood, sat enthroned on his lofty stool from whence he usually watched over his literary realm. In his hand he held a ruler, that sceptre of classroom power. A paddle of justice hung on 3 nails behind his throne, a constant terror to the evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen a collection of contraband articles and prohibited items detected upon the children, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, and whole legions of rampant little paper games. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for the students were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a black man in an old jacket and trousers, a round crowned fragment of a hat, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of a halter. He came clattering up to the school door with his invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry-making frolic being held that evening at the Van Tassels, and, having delivered his message, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away, full of importance and hurry of his mission. All was now hustle and bustle in the schoolroom. The students were hurried through their lessons. Those who were slow had a smart application now and then to their rear to quicken their speed. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was dismissed an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, cheering in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour in the mirror, brushing and furbishing up his best and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks. In order to make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was staying with, a choleric old Dutchman by the name of Hans van Ripper, and gallantly mounted the steed like a knight in quest of adventures. I suppose I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some description of the looks and equipments of my hero and his steed. The animal he rode was a broken-down plough horse that outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was scrawny and skeletal, with a thin neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was ghostly, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and spirit in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favourite steed of his master's, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider and had infused, very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal. For old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his head, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans Van Ripper, a sight you would seldom expect to see in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumn day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden uniform which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forest had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant colors of orange, purple, and scarlet. Flocks of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring field. The small birds were eating their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their revelry they fluttered, chirping, frolicking from bush to bush and tree to tree. There was the honest cock robin, the favorite game of sportsmen with its loud cantankerous note, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds, and the golden-winged woodpecker with its crimson crest and splendid plumage, and the cedar bird with its red-tipped wings, yellow-tipped tail, and the little cap of feathers, and the noisy blue jay in his light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, nodding, bobbing, bowing, and pretending to be on good terms with every songster in the grove. As Ichabod rode slowly along, his eyes ranged with delight over the treasures of the jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive richness on the trees, some gathered in baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Further on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy covers and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious pies. He passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing in the odor as he dreamed of pancakes well buttered and garnished with honey or syrup, by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. The sun gradually began to set in the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy, except for the occasional blue shadow of the distant mountain. A few amber clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them, and the horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into pure apple green, and from that into a deep blue of the mid-heaven. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Van Tassel's, which he found packed with people from the adjacent country, old farmers, a leather-faced race in homespun coats and pants, blue stocking, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk little females in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats, and calico pockets. Buxom lasses. The sons in short, square-skirted coats with rows of large brass buttons, and their hair generally combed in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eel-skin, as it was esteemed throughout the country as a potent strengthener of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed Daredevil, a creature like himself full of pluck and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, for he believes that a well-broken horse was unworthy of a lad with spirit. I must pause to mention the world of charms that burst upon the eyes of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. I do not refer to the number of buxom lasses with their luxurious displays of red and white, but instead to the ample amounts of Dutch country food heaped upon the tea-table, platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, doughnuts, crisp crullers, sweet cakes, shortcakes, ginger cakes, and honey cakes, and then there were the apple pies, and the peach pies, and the pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears, not to mention roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled with a giant teapot, sending up its clouds of vapor. I wish I had the breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, but I am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry, and did a good job trying some of all of it. Ichabod was a kind and thankful creature whose heart expanded with good cheer and whose spirits rose with eating. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all of this luxury and splendor. Then, he thought, how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse and kick any other schoolmaster out of doors that should dare to call him comrade. Old Bautis Van Tassel moved among his guests with a face filled with good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief, but expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to help themselves. Then the sound of music from the common room summoned them to dance. The musician was an old grey-headed black man who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with the motion of a head, bowing almost to the ground, and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple were to start. Ichabod wasted no time in accompanying Katrina to the dance floor. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a group of folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the porch, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with tales of great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of much looting and pillaging, and was infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little fiction, and in the indistinctness of his recollection to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was a story of Dufour Martling, a large, blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British compound with a rusty old 9-shooter, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman who shall be nameless due to his immense wealth, who, in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz around the blade and glance off it at the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, all of whom believed that they had a considerable hand in bringing the war to happy termination. Ichabod, of course, loved stories and storytelling. One of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass along winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, as they sat spinning by the fire, with rows of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listened to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn around, and that they were half the time upside down. But if there was a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all aglow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dared to show its face, it was horribly offset by the terrors of his subsequent walks home. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of snowy night. With that wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the fields from some distant window. How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow which, like a sheeted spectre, plagued his very path. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder lest he should behold some crude being trampling closely behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by a rustling blast of wind howling among the trees. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. Daylight put an end to all these evils. It wasn't long until the music began again, summoning the townspeople to the dance floor for a few more rounds. Later, as Bautis Van Tassel noticed it was time for his party-goers to sit and catch their breath, he stepped forward into the crowd. Now, my friends, before we partake in another dance, shall we gather round for a tale or two, a ghost tale or two. And of course, Mr. Crane, our resident history of New England witchcraft expert, should sit in the chair of honor right by the fire.
Mr. Van Tassel, I'm honored. So terribly honored.
The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats. There is no encouragement for ghosts in most larger cities, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves into their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, leaving them with no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the commonness of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from their haunted region and breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and nightmares infecting all the land.
Do you know many ghost stories, Mr. Crane?
Indeed I do. I have many a tale up my sleeve. I am also well aware that this area is a veritable bonanza of anecdotes, allegories, and accounts of a spectral nature.
Don't you ever get frightened? Telling stories by the fire is one thing when everyone's around, but when I'm alone, a tree branch waving in the wind makes me think there are ghosts and goblins at every turn.
Oh, it sends shivers down my spine.
Do ghost stories scare you, Mr. Crane?
You see, the truth of it is that, well, no, my dear. Of course ghost stories don't frighten me, and why should they? I mean, they're only stories after all, isn't that right? Only stories? I welcome them. No tale is too gross or monstrous for my appetite. They're nothing to be scared of. Nothing at all.
All of Ichabod's stammering suddenly struck a chord with Brom and his friends, who had been listening in from across the floor.
Oh-ho!
What?
Oh-ho!
What?
Oh-ho-ho!
What are you oh-hoing for?
Idiot.
Ow! What?
Didn't you hear what the schoolteacher just said?
He said he's not afraid of ghost stories.
Those may have been the words he said, but...
Isn't that what you asked us? I mean... Don't hit me, I'll do it myself. Ow!
That's what he said, but that's not what he meant. I think he's scared of ghost stories. I think when it's dark out and the lights from the nearest house are gone and he's following the path through the dense thicket, he's really, really scared.
So, what are you going to do?
Not wanting to be overheard, Brom ushered his friends into a distant corner of the room as the rest of the party-goers settled in for some spooky fun. Who will be first? Who has a story to tell of haunted fields, haunted books, haunted bridges, haunted houses, haunted streams?
How about haunted trees? Major Andre's tree. Poor Major Andre.
Poor, he was in cahoots with Benedict Arnold.
Creak, creak, rope on wood. Right there's where Major Andre stood. Creak, creak, rope on bark. Thought he'd be able to escape in the dark. Creak, creak, rope on skin. Major Andre's gone hangin'. Major Andre swinging from the tree. Get too close and you might see. Andre was tried and determined to spy. His punishment meant he had to die. If you go by and the stars are bright, the air is crisp and the moon is right. A swinging shadow darkens the ground, and listen for the creaking sound. Major Andre swinging from the tree. Get too close and you might see.
Have you ever seen his shadow?
No, have you?
I'll never go by that tree alone.
Noticing the anxiety beginning to set in over Ichabod's demeanor, Brom decided to seize an opportunity for himself.
I have a favorite story, Ichabod. The one about the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Some of the folk around here say he was a German trooper, a Hessian. They say that during the Revolutionary War his head was carried off by a cannonball. Boom! And that he rides in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind in a quest to find his head. The rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow is like a midnight blast, His haunts are not just confined to the valley, though. Oh no, they extend, at times, to the adjacent roads. Guess what his favorite spot for haunting is?
I'm sure I couldn't say.
Remember the bridge, school teach? The church bridge?
The church bridge?
Did you notice anything special about that covered bridge?
It seemed, well, somewhat...
Somewhat what?
Well, just a touch dark.
And
Frightening.
And
Haunted. It seemed haunted.
The Headless Horseman had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and it was said, tethered his horses nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered location of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its whitewashed walls shine modestly forth like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which slight glances may be caught of the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that the dead might, at least, rest in peace there. On one side of the church extends a wild, woody dell, along which runs a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a fearful and gloomy darkness about it, even in the daytime. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. Brom told the tale of old Brower.
Brower was a most profane disbeliever in ghosts when he suddenly met the horsemen along the road in Sleepy Hollow. They galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge. That's when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder.
Brom immediately followed this story with one about himself. He affirmed that on returning one night from a neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper.
I offered to race with him, and should have won it, too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse. But just as we came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. The church bridge is one of his favorite haunts, school teach. You'll have to be careful going home tonight, Ichabod, but don't worry. Everyone knows once you cross the bridge, you're safe. If you get across it before he catches you, that is. Good luck, Ichabod.
The party gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted saddles behind their favorite lover, and the light-hearted laughter, mingling with the clatter of the hoofs, echoed along the silent woodland, sounding fainter and fainter, until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have some private time with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, must have gone wrong, for he certainly rushed out after only a short amount of time, with an air quite desolate and dejected. Oh, these women! Could that girl have been playing flirtatious tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor schoolmaster all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod left with the air of one who had been sacking a hen-roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he might so often have gloated, he went straight to the stable, and, with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and disappointed, headed homewards along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had travelled so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened, would sound far, far off from some farmhouse among the hills, but it was like a dreaming around in his ear. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard came flooding back into his mind. The night grew darker and darker, and the stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky as driving clouds occasionally hid them from sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had taken place. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again in the air. It was connected with the tragic story of the unfortunate Major Andre. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was just a blast of wind sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been blasted by lightning and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly, he heard a groan. Ichabod's teeth chattered, and his knees knocked against the saddle, but it was only the rubbing of one huge branch upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new peril lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road, where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with wild grapevines threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that this unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covers of those chestnuts and vines is where the soldiers who surprised him concealed themselves. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all of his determination, gave his horse several kicks to the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the rein on the other side and kicked lustily with the other foot. It was all in vain, however. His steed started, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of blueberry and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a small noise by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveller. Ichabod's hair rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and flee was now too late, and beside, what chance was there of escaping a ghost or goblin who could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, in a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, Who are you? But there was no answer.
I asked, Who are you?
Still there was no answer. Once more he kicked the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, and shutting his eyes broke forth with involuntary fervor into a hymn. Just then, the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, the form of the unknown could in some degree now be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He gave neither a hint of molestation or sociability, but kept remote on one side of the road, jogging along the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no enjoyment for this strange companion, quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled and fell into a walk. Hoping to lag behind, the other did the same. His heart began to sink as he tried to resume humming a hymn, but his parched tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a sound. There was something in the moody silence of his companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure up against the moonlit sky, it was apparent that he was gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak. Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulder, was carried before him in the front of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained up a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the scepter started at full speed with him. Away then! They dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lanky body over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow. But Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy, hollow shade of trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge just beyond the whitewashed church. The panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an advantage in the chase, but just as he got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way and Ichabod felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and tried to hold it firm, but it was in vain. Ichabod had just enough time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder around the neck as the saddle fell to the ground, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his hunches, and he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping to one side and sometimes on the other, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he feared would cut him in half. An opening in the trees filled him with hope, and the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of the silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He remembered the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared.
If I can reach that bridge, I am safe.
Just then, he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs of old Gunpowder sprang him upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks and got to the opposite side. Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer would vanish according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone. He saw the goblin rise in his stirrups and hurl his head at him. Ichabod tried to dodge the horrible missile, but it was too late. It slammed against his cranium with a tremendous crash, and he was tumbled headlong into the dust as the black steed and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning Gunpowder was found without his saddle and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearances at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. Students assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. After diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed were traced to the bridge. On the bank of the broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all of Ichabod's worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 scarves for the neck, a pair or 2 of socks, an old set of corduroy clothes, a rusty razor, a book of hymns, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, except Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling. These magic books were burned by Hans Van Ripper. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had on his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Groups of gazers and gossipers were collected in the churchyard at the bridge and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brower, of Bones, and many others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was moved to a different quarter of the hollow, and another schoolmaster reigned in his place. It is true an old farmer, who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, brought home information that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in shame of having been suddenly dismissed by Katerina Van Tassel. It was said that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the court. Brom Bones, too, who, shortly after his rival's disappearance, took the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favourite story often told about the neighbourhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of Ichabod. Some claim that on a still summer evening you can hear a distant voice humming a melancholy tune among the tranquil solitude of Sleepy Hollow. You've been listening to Macabre Mansion Presents The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, based on the classic story by Washington Irving. Starring Kylie Bear, Virginia Hay, Tiffany LaBarbera, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, Jim O'Rear, and Daniel Roebuck. Script adaptation by Jim O'Rear. Directed and produced by Kevin Herron in association with MM Media LLC. Copyright 2011 by MM Media LLC. All rights reserved. Visit www.macabremansion.com for more information.
Also starring Andy Barnett.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.